What if space wasn't just for man? And no, I'm not talking about the space chimps or space dogs. And if you take man more literally, I'm not talking about women either. What if, instead, we let our cats build a rocket? Meet my two cats, Bo and Snickers. You might know Bo from a previous video where I had him build a custom aircraft and fly out. This young, goofy, and shamelessly dependent cat helped me build a plane and fly out for making decisions in a door gate. Today, Bo will be coming back for some more help, but he's not going to be alone. This is my other cat, Snickers. She's a very old and a very loving cat. As she has had plenty of experience in life, she too wanted to help build our space mission here as the chief mission planner. The game I will be playing is Kerbal Space Program. As it's been one of my favorite games since I was a kid, KSP is one of the best games to launch rockets, fly planes, and conduct experiments with its physics engine. It's a real shame it didn't get any sequels or anything, really. Nope, no sequels at all. Kerbal Space Program, just like every other popular game with spacemen, involves a lot of slaughter. These poor green men and women die like hamsters in endless sadistic experiments performed by you, the creator. Can a Kerbal survive in space? Can a Kerbal act as a cushion for a 300-ton space plane? Can you launch a Kerbal at Mach with a centrifuge? All very important and scientific questions that we shouldn't hesitate to test. These Kerbals will gladly and happily board a rocket that looks like it was made by a toddler named the Kerbal Smasher 1 without a moment of hesitation, only to be blown up in low atmosphere as the rocket inevitably disintegrates. In today's launch, however, I'll be relinquishing my ability to torture these spacemen and instead allowing my cats to design a hopefully successful space launch. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, Messier, how are you going to get your cat to figure out how to build your rockets? And well, that's exactly where the fun comes in. You see, these cats love to walk around. From the walks around the neighborhood that Snickers goes on to the zoomies Bo gets dodging in and out of my bedroom. Here is my door frame. This bedroom door frame would be modified to measure decisions from these cats. Here's how it works. At the top of the door frame, various options are spread out across a piece of tactical adhesive paper equipment, abbreviated tape. On this tape, various lengths of string would be suspended and dangled down to the door's threshold, acting as dividers or channels for the cat to walk through. On top of this, a 2x4 was installed at the base of the door frame, heightening the threshold and breaking the cat's typical habits when they run through the door. By walking through any of these dividers, they would be choosing a decision. After extensively briefing my cats on all of the options, it was time to run some tests. Snickers got the first two choices for the spacecraft, as she was the chief designer after all. Choice number one was pretty simple. Would I be making a conventional rocket or a space plane? Snickers thought long and hard about this one, choosing to build a space plane over the conventional rocket. Alright. I've only made a few SSTOs in orbital capable space planes, but I'm sure it would go well. And not like explode or anything. Next question, the most major defining feature of the vehicle from here would be payload weight. According to the rocket equation, fuel fraction is a pretty big part of actually getting to space. Rockets will get exponentially bigger assuming the heavier payload is used. So for payload weight, we had options from virtually zero payload or maybe some science equipment all the way up to the ultra heavy payload, which would result in a greater than 200-ton space plane. Snickers chose the ultra-heavy payload on her way out, meaning that this spaceplane would have to be massive. From there, Snickers handed off the decision-making to Bo, who would choose our target planet and mission objectives. First things first, the destination. There are a lot of planets to choose from in KSP, far too many to list in a single option frame for Bo, so we needed to start a little bit broader. Firstly, I asked him if we would be doing a one-way trip or a two-way trip. Bo quickly answered with a two-way trip, meaning we'd either need to pack enough fuel for the return trip, mine from the surface, or send ourselves over with a deep space propulsion station attached to the back. After this, I found a Delta V map of the entire system, including a surface landing and takeoff Delta V calculation, and the Kerbin entry Delta V. While it would never realistically get into these numbers due to aero braking for landing as well as other factors, it allowed us to categorize all planets in a fair and balanced way. The options started from the low 10 to 15 km per second launches of the Moon, Minmus, and other small bodies, and went all the way up to the dreaded greater than 25 km per second launches, such as Eve. Bo chose the 20 to 25 km per second launches, which is also the smallest category, only containing Moho and Lathe. The majority of all planets and other moons of Juul were under 20k due to their higher orbits and smaller gravity wells. This meant for our final planetary decision, Bo would get to choose whether or not we'd visit Moho, the airless planet closest to the Sun, or Lathe, a temperate, breathable terrestrial moon of Juul, or the resident gas giant of the KSP system. Bo ended up choosing Lathe, which I was actually pretty happy about because it made the whole point of a spaceplane a lot more interesting, and it would lead to an exciting planetary approach. Plus, that meant our Kerbals could enjoy the dim sunlight and warm conditions of the far-out moon. Let's talk about Lathe a little bit. While Lathe as a moon is breathable, the crew report mentions that it smells horrible. This is presumably due to the high levels of sulfur in its atmosphere. Lathe, due to its distance from the Sun, could not possibly support liquid oceans on its own. Instead, the gravitational forces of Juul, the nearby gas giant, along with the Sun and all the other moons of Juul, push and pull on the planet with gravitational forces. This warms up the planet as it's stretched and compressed in a process called tidal heating, and it presumably allows Lathe to exist with its temperate climate and breathable atmosphere in the first place. However, all this tidal heating certainly means high levels of volcanism, and high amounts of volcano means high levels of sulfur. As we all know, sulfur smells very bad. Unfortunately for humans, high levels of sulfur dioxide can be poisonous as it forms sulfuric acid in contact with water. This will irritate your lungs, eyes, and nose, which all contain water, meaning that you'd need a special respirator and mask to breathe on this planet for prolonged periods. Luckily enough for Kerbals, however, this doesn't seem to bother them, other than the awful smell. Regardless, Lathe remains one of the most unique and interesting planets in the Kerbal system, meaning that I was happy to go there. I was encountering a problem with the cat measurement system, however. Bo always takes the path of least resistance. Every time he enters my room, his goal is to either reach the bed or desk as quickly as possible, as that's where I typically pet him. This is also why you see him run in so quickly in each video. As cute as this is, it meant that Bo always favored the option closest to one side of the doorframe, and as the threshold had been there for a while, he was getting used to it and wasn't breaking his rhythm anymore. To solve this, I quickly installed a particle board in a very jerry-rigged fashion that would be sure to break his habit. While it was flimsy, I didn't care as I only had one more question to ask, and that was the primary payload. Secondary lighter payloads would be installed alongside this, but this would be the main focus of the mission. Our options were either surface equipment / a drill, a heavy rover, and a folding wing aircraft. Bo ran through the center gate, thus choosing the heavy rover. With all the main mission parameters taken care of, it was time to fund and build the project. You see, here at the KSC, we don't have nearly enough funding to build a space mission capable of conducting this launch. So what we need is investors. Outside the Space Center, we put an ad in the classified section of Kerbal Weekly. The ad mentions our mission to Lathe and promises beautiful sights and real breathable air this time, unlike our less successful mission to Minmus. This ad attracted 3 billionaire investors, each wanting their own multi-year vacation off the planet. Our 3 unnamed and legally distinct billionaire passengers will be accompanying Jeb, Bill, Bob, and Val on the journey. These wealthy investors each gave 200,000 resources, and in return they got to fill out special requests. The 2 men required a luxurious habitation inside the rover to act as a trailer while they shot a new blockbuster movie about Lathe, as they requested to film on site. The last Kerbal merely asked for a private aircraft and pilot to fly her short distances across the planet while she recorded music on Lathe. So a quick list of our goals. We need to make a space plane with ultra-heavy payload, mission to Lathe and eventually back, but I'll save the back part for part 2, heavy rover, and private aircraft. Oh boy, this was going to be a difficult one. Well, let's start by thinking about how we're going to build our space plane. First of all, I don't want the space plane to be gigantic, and I wanted it to be able to easily escape the gravity of Kerbin and Lathe with an ultra-heavy payload, so I would save the high-efficiency deep space transport to be a docked module. The rover and plane combined with mining equipment would be very heavy, weighing in at a total payload weight of approximately 8 to 10 tons. The addition of living space for the Kerbals as well as docking space and control modules, the payload weight total ended up being over 10 tons. Once you include the airframe elements of having a working space plane, all of which had to be launched with, and returned to the surface with this space plane, the Kerbal space plane would have to be huge, at least by KSP standards. The final weight ended up being approximately 288 tons. Let's take a look at our space plane. This vehicle weighs about 280 tons and is made up of 298 parts, really pushing the capabilities of the game. The vehicle has a takeoff TWR of approximately 0.8, quickly gaining thrust due to the multi-cycle Rapier engines, a knockoff of the Sabre multi-cycle rocket engine, not to be confused with this Sabre engine or this Sabre aircraft. This allows the vehicle to burn only liquid fuel in an air-breathing mode and accelerate up to Mach 4.5 in the atmosphere. Once an altitude of about 21 kilometers is reached, the air starts to quickly fade away. The engine switched to a closed cycle, relying on liquid fuel plus oxidizer to propel it the rest of the way into orbit. From this point on, a docking port is attached to the back of the vehicle, and a space station responsible for interplanetary transport would be attached to the back. It would also use this port for refueling in low orbit. Onboard adjustable docking equipment along with a convertitron would be included in the cargo bay, allowing the rover to return to the ship after mining resources and refuel it once it reaches the surface of Lathe. Lastly, onboard batteries, collapsible solar panels, and extendable antennae ensured that whilst in space and stationary, the vehicle would be allowed to charge itself and keep contact with the KSC throughout the entirety of its multi-year transfer to Juul. As I started to build the vehicle, I built it with a box wing structure, as the improved wing area and reinforcement using the in-game strut tool would help keep a rigid airframe and keep the craft in one piece during Lathe's atmospheric entry. Each engine had its own individual intake and was comprised of these unique Mark II part engine pods. This lets us use a total of 12 Rapier engines, which would hopefully be sufficient thrust to exit the atmosphere. In the first test, I included an awkward bubble cockpit in the front of the vehicle, which I would be switching out a little bit later for a different style. Anyways, with our plane mostly complete, it was time for our first test flight. Let's see how it goes. Well, that could have gone a little bit better, huh? Well, let's discuss what went wrong. You see, in real life, the center of pressure ends up being on the leading edge of the wing. This is because it's the part of the wing with the most drag, and therefore is also the part with the furthest forward center of pressure or center of lift. As your alpha increases, the center of pressure slowly moves down the wing, approaching the trailing edge. While it does move back, especially with the vortex lift configuration of these wings, it certainly doesn't move far. Now in the original KSP, since each wing is its own separate piece, the center of pressure is measured on the leading edge of each wing, thus moving it back from where it's supposed to be. This means that my center of lift is moved artificially back, causing some lift problems with the vehicle. To counter this weird effect, I added a leading edge root extension or lurks running down the entire fuselage to the nose of the vehicle, and seeing as the air was already a bit out the window, I wasn't too worried about the top intakes ingesting a yummy vortex from the lurks. On top of this, a small angled wing was positioned inside the nose of the vehicle to help with a more realistic center of pressure balance overall. With the inclusion of these streaks as well as 2 large SRBs for a quicker takeoff run as well as a prettier nose, we were finally ready for our first orbital test. Our rotation and climb out for VY proved much quicker and smoother this time, with the improved airframe and SRBs helping us get off the ground. The first thing to note about this orbital test is that I was having a bit of trouble keeping the vehicle straight, meaning that we needed extra airframe reinforcement in the form of struts, which we were doing after this flight test. After gaining speed and altitude to about 1,200 meters per second at 20 kilometers, the engine switched to closed cycle traditional rocket mode. Using this mode, we were able to quickly extend our trajectory into orbit along with a positive rate flare to give us a higher initial vertical speed, trading out that little remaining atmosphere for a boost in our apogee. After we finally got up there and did a singular orbit, a retro burn was entered to test the vehicle's re-entry dynamics. Jumping into the atmosphere just before the KSC, the air brakes and general approach angle helped us slow down very quickly using the atmosphere. Re-entry speeds of about 2,000 meters per second were the maximum we could hit before starting to overheat and destroy our components. This would be important later. After gliding in a little bit past the KSC, we entered our base and put some power into the spaceplane's engines. During our little extended base turn here, you can very clearly see the wing flex problem we're having during maneuvering once again. These non-rigid wings were causing problems with keeping straight. We lined up for a nice little final down runway 27, confirmed with bearing 270 on the nav ball. We flared and made a surprisingly soft landing, albeit a bit off-center. I'm just happy to be alive after those problems with our spaceplane being so floppy. With Jeb safely back to the KSC, it was time to move on to the construction of our payloads. I tested out a few secondary payloads as well as landing soft field in the middle of nowhere on Kerbin to practice the adverse terrain landings I'd be conducting on Lathe. Unfortunately, due to budgetary and payload weight reasons, this is going to be nothing more than a paraglider. On top of this, I started to design the luxury rover for the cargo bay. Now let's talk about the rover a little bit because the rover is the only modded part of the vehicle. Now of course, adding mods is important and questionable in some ways. It's important to ensure that what you add to your game is only pertinent to your missions and isn't overpowered in a way that might break your immersion or make it too easy. That's why, surely for the sake of space travel, I added a 7-barrel 30mm Gatling gun that shoots at 1,200. Alright, maybe that's a little too far. Instead, I added a few rover parts, tweak scale, and some graphical mods that improved the quality of life without breaking stock immersion. If you want, you can follow along with each video as I will be posting my most recent mod pack in the description, most likely as a Google Drive link. Ignoring that rover, everything on my spaceplane was 100% stock, which I took as a prideful accomplishment at least in some way. After all this was added to the vehicle, I wanted to complete my final orbital test. This is in fact a fully loaded spaceplane, so if we make it to orbit, this will be the first step of our mission. If not, it'll be back to the drawing board. So in a lot of ways, this is the moment of truth. The test was completed for the most part without a hitch, reaching orbital velocity without a problem. From there, it was time to refuel it in space and have full fuel for the Lathe re-entry. If I had a chance to redo this, I would probably only carry an oxidizer at half capacity to conserve weight, especially since I planned on refueling the vehicle on the planet. Many of our late stage problems with this mission could have been avoided if I had done this. Instead, we would have had more Delta V to play around with during our transfer to Juul. Either way, I quickly constructed a rocket capable of bringing a moderate payload into low Kerbin orbit, later allowing us to dock with the spaceplane. Here in space, after spending way too much fuel learning how to dock again, we finally made it to the spaceplane. Let's see how much we get in there. The answer, apparently not nearly enough. So for the next mission, I simply built and launched an even bigger refueling rocket and got to it in one go. It was finally time to launch the space station. The space station was designed with lots of fuel and the Kerbal atomic rocket motor. The atomic rocket motor in KSP is a type of engine known simply as nuclear thermal rocket. Essentially, the nuclear thermal rocket uses direct cycle heat from some radioactive material to superheat the fuel in place of combustion. Ultimately, this gas is heated to a more significant degree than traditional chemical combustion, and therefore exits the rocket motor at a higher velocity, making the engine ultimately more efficient. Remember, part 1 of that rocket equation is exhaust velocity. The higher you can get your exhaust velocity, the further your rocket's gonna go. Luckily for us, this also means the rocket does not need to carry any oxidizer, only a single type of fuel, as the nuclear material will heat it no matter what. This allows us to go even further on a smaller tank of gas, which is perfect for ferrying our giant 300-ton spaceplane here to another planet. We'll be attaching this giant station to the back of our spaceplane through the large docking collar we previously used to fuel it. From there, onboard reaction wheels, RCS thrusters, and solar panels should ensure the space station is appropriately powered and maneuverable. Thanks to the rocket equation mentioned earlier, I did a little bit of math for our Delta-V calculations. To make it to Juul and have a little bit of fuel to spare, we needed an ultimate fuel fraction of approximately 0.5. With a specific impulse of 800 and a fuel fraction of around 0.5, we should have about 5,400 meters per second of Delta-V. To get from low Kerbin orbit to a geostationary orbit with Lathe, we'd need about 4,000 meters a second of Delta-V. This would give us plenty of extra Delta-V to play around with, so I thought it was a pretty good goal to aim for. So I set off to make a space station that, including the payload weight of the spaceplane, would be equal to about a 0.5 fuel fraction. Although that meant, as a good estimate, this space station would likely weigh over 600 tons. How would we get up there in a single launch? Well, the answer is after I accidentally overwrite my file and need to do everything again. Oh boy. Luckily an old version of my spaceplane was saved, so I built off of that. In my haste, however, I forgot like all of the science equipment I was supposed to bring with us to Lathe and didn't realize till we were halfway there. Oh well. I also had to completely rebuild the private aircraft as well as the rover, and once again, in my haste, I forgot to neutralize prop torque on the plane and I forgot to add retractable solar panels to the rover, which would be essential to refueling the spaceplane. Oh boy, this mission was getting more and more difficult by the minute. I still wish the game didn't reset everything, but it was also my fault for playing with save files and accidentally overwriting one. Either way, that meant I had to redo everything else besides half my airplane. The rover, the personal aircraft, the station, all of it. The station launch vehicle ended up being one of the most absurd launch vehicles I've ever made. To have enough thrust to get off the ground, I needed a lot of engines, so I turned to a less conventional style of building rockets. Meet the station launch vehicle. As you might notice, the station sits in the center of the launch platform attached to the ground. From here, as you move your way out, various rocket motors are positioned radially instead of directly below the payload. This is referred to as onion staging in the KSP community, as each engine breaks off the outside as if you were peeling layers of an onion. While this is technically less efficient than the traditional style of rocket, it provides a lot more thruster area and therefore makes it far easier to design an ultra-heavy launch vehicle. The launch vehicle in total weighed 4,785 tons. Despite the generally smaller payloads of KSP, this station was still heavier than just about any real-life launch vehicle. The rocket would activate all non-payload motors at once, producing a staggering 5,500 kilonewtons of thrust on takeoff. To give you an idea, that's enough to lift over 5,600 tons of weight. This is about the same weight and thrust as SpaceX's Starship, which currently holds the record for the heaviest flying vehicle. This gigantic launch platform is designed to get my entire now 800-ton space station into low Kerbin orbit. From the moment we launch to the moment we dock, the orbit will almost entirely rely on chemical propulsion and is only activating its nuclear thermal rockets and a suborbital trajectory to fully circularize and intercept the spaceplane that is already in orbit. Once we finally docked with the spaceplane, it was finally time to start our Juul transfer. Our goal would be to transfer to Juul, transfer to Lathe, and then leave the space station in orbit as we go to the surface. Once we were on the surface, we would drill for materials, refuel the spaceplane, and bring that extra fuel up to the space station. Once we were done refueling it, we could once again return to Kerbin. After about 164 days in orbit, Juul was at the perfect position for a transfer maneuver. Leaving Kerbin was a bit rough as we accidentally slingshot off the moon back into a Kerbin orbit, but after that we prepared for an almost 20-minute long prograde burn using the nuclear rockets. This burn extended our trajectory far into space where it would directly intercept Juul's sphere of influence at a rather odd angle. This is just because I didn't make sure that my ascending node was correct. After this maneuver, we began the long and cold trip to Juul. Over the almost 3 years it took our Kerbal crew to reach the planet, who knows what happened. For the first time in Kerbal history, our crew had spacious habitation modules, enjoying an almost luxurious crew capsule volume, along with the luxury rover parked in the cargo bay in case anyone wanted to spend some time apart from the rest of the crew. As the sunlight dwindled and the crew got closer to Juul, I also noticed a reduced solar panel charge rate. While this was not a problem, it would be important to remember while flying our solar-powered private jet, as literally all of our vehicles are charged through solar power. After the time was up, we finally entered the Juul sphere of influence. We were running slightly lower on fuel than I expected, which was concerning to say the least. You see, when I launched the space plane, it weighed in at around 270 tons. This is because I did not take a full load of fuel, instead only taking the fuel I required to get into space. Essentially, on launch I removed fuel and oxidizer to save weight, especially because we were taking a full payload and I wanted to be as high thrust to weight as possible. In my calculation initially, I used this lowered value. While refueling the craft, instead I took full oxidizer and fuel, thus making this spaceplane heavier. While the liquid fuel could be transferred onto the nuclear thermal rocket motors and used as fuel, the oxidizer itself aboard the craft was nothing but dead weight. This dead weight totaled in at a whole extra 15 tons. While due to the scale of this vehicle this wasn't an insane increase in weight, I didn't pack all too much extra fuel for a Juul transfer. This is because in my calculations, I also forgot to include the weight of the thermal rocket motors. And these things were actually surprisingly heavy. So at the end of the day, we had a sub 50% fuel fraction. This meant that in the Deep Space Transfer Station, we only had around 3,600 meters per second of delta V. This was about 400 short of entering orbit of Lathe, and due to our inefficient transfer was only going to get worse. As we entered Juul's influence sphere, I also made it a point to burn retro into a Lathe transfer orbit, although I would call it more of a directly falling out of the sky until we're next to our target, as we basically slowed down to zero while entering Lathe's sphere of influence. As we fell down to Lathe, and once again entered a retro burn, the unfortunate happened. I ran out of fuel. So I sort of panicked, but not to worry, I had thought of a solution. While we did carry extra oxidizer, we also had an abundance of liquid fuel. So if there was any liquid fuel that couldn't be burned in space, aka didn't have equivalent oxidizer to go with it, I could directly transfer it into the space station's motors. As this was also an air-breathing spaceplane, I had a lot of spare liquid fuel lying around. So I got to work selecting every single node and transferring it into the tank. Believe it or not, we half-filled 2 whole Mark III liquid fuel fuselages with the spare fuel we were bringing. So after completing another burn, we realized it still wasn't enough. So in order to avoid going off into some high Juul orbit, we did the unthinkable. We undocked from the space station and continued our retro burn towards Lathe. As we had just gotten rid of all excess liquid fuel, the space plane was much lighter now. This would give us a little bit of extra delta V. And unfortunately, this also meant we wouldn't be able to keep the station, and instead it would go off on its escape trajectory. I guess a Kerbal rescue mission is on the menu for part 2? Either way, we had just enough fuel to burn ourselves into a rather steep atmospheric approach, but I couldn't risk running out of fuel, so I had to keep it steep. On approach, just before entering the atmosphere, I did a quick retro burn to keep our speed just around 2,000 meters per second. If you remember from earlier in the video, any faster and I risked destroying the craft from re-entry heating. What I didn't account for was the gravity once again pushing me past that 2,000 meter per second mark shortly after my retro burn. It was going to be a close one, but I couldn't risk burning any more fuel. More fuel burnt meant that I would have less fuel to try to pick a landing zone later. So for now, we had to deal with it. On approach, I extended my air brakes fully. I put the nose just a few degrees above the velocity vector in hopes of bleeding a little bit of that extra speed without causing too much re-entry friction. I really wish I had an ablator right about now. By some miracle, we made it into the atmosphere without disintegrating. With nothing but a small fraction of fuel left on the spaceplane, we couldn't be too picky about our landing zones. Spotting this at least somewhat flat-looking beach, not really flat, but close enough, I quickly made a left base and lined myself up with it. From this angle, it appeared as extremely unflat, but it was easily the flattest terrain in the immediate vicinity, so it would have to do. After doing a shallow flare for final approach and bracing for impact, we surprisingly made it down to the surface of Lathe without any harm being done to our spacecraft or any components. What a chaotic flight for first contact. It's KSP after all. Either way, it was finally time to unload our components and plant our flag, our first touchdown ever on Lathe. As a kid, I never really did a mission to Lathe, mostly because I was very bad at transfer orbits. The fact that now, quite a few years later, I can finally do a complete mission is actually pretty nice. It reminds me of what it was like to be a kid again, and I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. After fighting for basically every inch of the way there, our crew was finally safe to conduct their activities. With the private plane and luxury rover deployed, the crew could enjoy the warm temperatures, nice beaches, and beautiful backdrop of Juul while exploring the planetary surface.